things that they wouldn't otherwise see. And with regard to that colonialism, I think that's an interesting part of it, which makes me immediately think of the Ugandan case. There you see, do you see the task there for writers more or less the same, or telling the story differently, or telling different stories about
yeah, because just like Pablo said, some of these, you know, like, people used to live, I know that in my community, because of passing information orally, so they are not documented, but there were gay people, you know, way back, and I know that my community recognized them, and they lived without any problems. We've also had, you know, kings in other communities, and, you know, like, so writing about that and making people understand that these things we've lived with maybe will help people understand that they don't need to point fingers at each other. Also, from what I've noticed is people, when they read, for instance, Jambula Tree by Monica Raj, if it's not put categorically that this is an LGBTI story, then they don't recognize that. They just see, you know, what they want to see, like, this is about friendship, this is about something else. And so
you secretly smuggle the topic in somehow, or
and I think that's how also some of the stories have been able to go into the newspapers, and people don't really point fingers or anything. So I think we'll just have to continue writing the different stories, and maybe, like, within Uganda, there might not be opportunities of publishing the stories in Uganda, or us creating our own spaces where we can write these stories, but finding spaces where these stories can be shared. The problem now is we have tabloids that are writing about not LGBT, because they're basically exposing people. Gay men exposed, and then they put your picture and everything, and write, and almost your address as well. So I think that's a misuse of that. But yeah, as a writer, you always continue to write about these issues.
Yeah. How do you go about your work, Babak, in terms of what a writer can do in this very limited, you know, area of possibilities you seem to have? What is your view on that?
Yes. What Paulo said was interesting for me about the homoerotic culture they used to have, and then the Spanish people, when they came there and they saw it as homosexuality. It was the same in Iran in the late 19th century. Iran is famous for having homoerotic culture. For example, in the classical literature, they have lots of things about men love or something like this. And then in the social customs, they have lots of they touching each other, they get each other's hand, and even if they are homosexual or not, they have homoerotic culture. And then when the Western representatives came to Iran at that time, they get shocked, and and they claim that homosexuality is a bad thing. Why your culture is like this? You should be like that, or should be heterosexual. And then our society started to think about its sexuality. And then our modern intellectuals refused homosexuality as a bad thing, because the Western eyes told them that this kind of homoerotic culture is a bad thing. And then the new object of love and new conception of love and sexuality appeared in my country. So I don't want to tell you the story, but I found lots of connection with our cultures. For example, what you said is the same in Iran. You can live secretly as a homosexual, but in public not.
Yeah.
What we can do by writing is, what I'm trying to do is to telling the stories of the lived experience of us, and try to have a new language for it, because we could tell some cliché stories about our life, but because I experienced to be queer as a different way of life, out of heteronormative rules, so the language and the kind of narration and description of our life experience should be more creative than the...
It's interesting, sort of, and by doing that, you know, going back to a tradition and identifying that tradition that was already there. Interesting. Damir, maybe briefly on Bosnia and what writers can do, or not only in Bosnia, perhaps the Balkans in general.
Well, I think writers can do a lot, and they do a lot. I think one major thing is to focus on undermining this fantasy of a community, to undermine the fantasy that we are kind of tightly knit together, and yeah, exactly, yeah. So it's this, but posing question to the society: what is a society? So if we also to go beyond this fascination with victimhood, but to find the positions from which we speak differently, transformatively, you know, because we can do all sorts of things with gender, but we cannot emancipate it. So the question is, how do you really emancipate it in practice? And then, don't let's forget, the question is predominantly what's going on through various activities, either of mainstreaming or through laws or through auto-censorship, is to sanitize sexuality, really. And how do you counter that? How do you actually open up the space for freedom, which is the space for sexual fantasy as well, and not free speech, right? But what is the position of fearless speech? Because if you widen the scope from that point, the question is one of what are the conditions of speaking, writing, and creating fearlessly and intervening.
And do you see examples somewhere around in Bosnia or more broadly in the Balkans of people or organizations or whatever?
Oh yes, I mean
who do that fearless speaking already?
Many of them really testifying. For instance, just one example. Rewriting the entire way of thinking about coming out. To me, as somebody who is a gay academic, and I write a lot about genocide, coming out means witnessing to war crimes and testifying to war crimes. So that's a way of coming out of the closet. So really
connecting to other issues, basically.
Making these kind of connections that and also learning from the past, but not just to make this kind of cumulative way of building the tradition, but really, how society is always already predicated on these, homosocial norms, and how we are not, the same in these little communities, but how there is a fundamental conflict in society that's trying to be kind of glossed over through these various attempts to excommunicate and punish certain groups.
Okay, I want to open it up to the audience. Who wants to ask a question for the panel members or have a comment? I see someone over there. You have to speak loudly, I guess. We don't have or maybe we do have. We can distribute a microphone and we can share one other microphone here. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
If you could briefly perhaps introduce
My
yourself.
name is Anna and I come from the Swedish Arts Council. And Damir, I have a question for you. What would you say is the most important in creating spaces, open spaces?
Shall we collect a few questions?
Let's collect a few questions. Yeah, okay, let's do that. There's a question over there. Oh, and over there as well. First there and then you, yeah.
Hi, Dave Rudden, Irish PEN. My question was for Damir and for Pablo. I was curious as to what you were saying, that you have the legislation but not necessarily the social kind of freedom. Yet I was curious, what kind of media bias are you dealing with? I know in Ireland we just had our referendum on same-sex marriage there, and it was difficult because there was an effort being made to control the language that we could have the debate. So at one point, one of the Yes campaigners was asked on television who he thought in Irish society was homophobic, and he named a couple of people, and they promptly sued for €85,000. So in effect, we were having a discussion, a national debate on gay rights, but we were not allowed to use the word homophobia. So I was curious what kind of media bias you're dealing with.
Interesting, thank you. I thought there was a question over there as well. Yep.
Hello, my name is Chenjira Iwowe. I live in Norway, but I come from Zimbabwe, and which is the same laws as Beatrice was saying, the same laws with Uganda, but the denial, which she emphasizes, is extremely important. That our president, for example, in Africa, they say homosexuality was brought by white people, which is a lie. So as a writer myself, what I did is I collected folk tales which were told from the beginning of time, which have homosexuality, including among animals. For example, one story which I published was a love affair between the rabbit and the lion. And it is there as a tradition, it's not my story. And it was a storm. The president was so furious. So this responsibility of the writer to go back and search for memory, to me is very important. To remind people that no, this is, people always want to deny, like when you have all the genocide which had happened, everybody denies that they killed people. People died on their own, So I think that reminding and that recapturing of memory is important.
Thank you. Perhaps we can respond. Damir, I think the first question was towards you.
Thank you for that question. I mean, in particular in Bosnia, for me, creating these spaces means going beyond this management of public space. And I think that the problem with public space is one that we forget about what kind of social ties are created. There is another problem of professionalizing. And I think through loads of NGOs, I mean, Bosnia is a very small country, 4 million people. There are over 10,000 NGOs. So whatever you have to do, you have to create an NGO, and then being micromanaged. There is this kind
of NGOization of Bosnia, they sometimes call it.
Exactly. There is this kind of, and the problem is that politics disappears from it, and this is about the political conflict, but at the same time making something and creating something affirmative, right? It's very easy to know what it is that you stand against, but what is it that you stand for is very important.
Exactly. Perhaps, Damir, you should tell us briefly something about something you did with the Love After Genocide initiative, and how perhaps, I know a bit about it, but maybe you can say about something about
how these public spaces operate. For instance, I mean, I'm known to do these things. I work with poetry, in particular, in neighborhoods, in communities, and cities, to initiate the speech about war and genocide, because loss and trauma of the war is either kind of medicalized, or it is denied, or it is very deeply politicized. So for me, so much is lost in this official way of commemorating, official way of speaking. So how do people then speak through poetry about their loss, about what it means for them today, and how do these very unusual encounters create, rather than, I as a Muslim meet you as a Serb, and then we kind of, through the discourse of tolerance, tolerate each other. Well, the multiculturalism that is brought the multiculturalism, that is very particular type of multiculturalism that is imported through the so-called democratization, through the nationalist elites, creates apartheid, creates segregation. So in Bosnia, we have 2 schools under one roof, ethnically divided. You know, that was never the case before. But really now, with the international community, that's how the West, the Western gaze, whatever that is, manages social conflict in Bosnia. That's how it can, you know, do it. For instance, another way of doing it is I work psychoanalytically. I also work to create spaces for people to speak, but also to get through things that are very unusual and very risky and dangerous, like jokes about genocide. There are loads of jokes about genocide. They are talked, and you know. But then when you start collecting them, working them, think about the unconscious of genocide that prevails still, and how the war still goes on, regardless of the end of the war, because peace never came to Bosnia. The conflict just ended. So
but just to add thing, I mean, with your Love After Genocide project and working with poetry, you just, you know, invited people to read their own poetry.
Exactly. To read the poetry, to come and speak, to bring their own material. It's, you know, it lasts for 2-3 days, and then, you know, with this kind of experiences, the major question is, because Bosnia is so divided and social ties are broken, how do we make the social ties anew, and what are the conditions under which we create that? For me, professionalizing it is really not a helpful way, because what you end up being, you just end up being as a rapporteur of violence committed against you. And then you end up just saying, oh, and this happened, and you know, you end up like the UN, you know, we remain to be committed in this matter without doing anything. Yeah, it's just, I'm being a bit crass perhaps, but you know, it is about how you really work in neighborhoods, really work with the people in properly grassroots to rethink things anew without any guarantees, you know, and how you hold affect, how you hold, you know, it's really interesting how you discover that anger doesn't need to be destructive necessarily, you know, but how it's prevalent and how you can hold it and keep it and work with it. So I think the position for me, for Bosnia, is a fundamental shift. Not just, you know, for years and years and years we counted what we lost in the war. But I think we fundamentally, and with the protests that took place last year, in 2014, huge protests, anti-corruption and anti-government protests, we actually started counting the gains from the war. We looked around and we saw that there is all this life that survived, that we stopped counting as life. And I think that therein lies a fundamental shift in the perspective when it comes to the social space. You know, what counts as life? And how do you create space for all this life to speak, beyond prohibitions?
Right. Yeah, and we also have to go to that second question about the media. But perhaps Pablo, you can respond to that.
I don't think there's nothing wrong with NGOs. I wanted to make that point because in my case, the NGO happened to me, and I've seen how it has grown through the years, how all the work that it does. And it's not a mere rapporteur, it's very strongly active in the ways that it gets things done in a broader sense of things. And this is very interesting when it has happened, because before we had Ministry of Women, and now it's being pushed into the legislation indigenous ministry, but we in the LGBTQI community and in our NGO in particular, we're trying to work this idea of, you know, that we are all the same, and we shouldn't be discriminated, we should be equal, and we should be, you know, wanting to get to a transformative equality idea of the society. I don't know why this because when you talk with a Mapuche person, they tell you, our problems are not your problems. because we are dealing with a political issue, and it's we have a nation's situation going on. And women, they said, you know, because I was trying to find a place to locate this anti-discrimination institution, and we were thinking about the women ministry, and the minister said, no, you know, our problems are different. So there is that danger of professionalization of your identity and not thinking about equality in a broader sense. But at the same time, there's like, and this could be an LGBTQI contribution to the conversation, we are always trying to put together all the organizations of, you know, this like special capacities people, Mapuche and everything. We are trying to gather the organizations, the NGOs that exist, but in Chile, at least in the LGBTQI issues, the NGOs have been, you know, fundamental. Without them, nothing would have been done. I want to say just a couple of things, because I was listening to Beatrice about how writers go around that. There's also in Chile an anthology of gay writers and lesbian writers through the times, and starts like in 1920s with a guy that wrote, like this is really irony, the love between a priest and one of his students. It was very subtle, of course, by that time. It was just like infatuation. It was like intellectual and religious infatuation, but, you know, it was a love affair. And since then we had people like, you know, Gabriela Mistral. And you can see now, looked from our time back, how the traces of their identity were already in their writing. And for example, Gabriela Mistral was always seen as the mother of our country, because she was our first Nobel Prize, and she fought for the postponed and women and people from rural areas. But now that we know, because all her you know, archives were liberated after her lover died, that she had a very intimate and beautiful personal life with her lover, and they sing together. There are these records of they singing together, and it's very beautiful, very touching. But people still want the mother, not the lesbian. Because they don't know what to do with the lesbian.
But the importance is to tell that other story, that it's there, and to bring it to the surface.
So we have this writing, and this and for you too. I think it could be, I don't know if there is a translation, but to have this idea of like the writing going on through the ages, and how the expression of the LGBTIQ identity it goes like step by step, because before the 90s and 2000, I told you, there was this great Chilean writer, José Donoso, and he was telling about he was married, he was very secluded about his homosexuality, but he was a homosexual, and all his homosexuality was transformed into like really phantasmagoric and very, you know, torture stories, but it was there. You can go and find it. So that's it.
Well, we went a little bit over time. I think this obviously is not, this conversation is not over. I mean, there's still a lot of material and a lot of fields we haven't covered. But I think we have to stop for lunch now. Thank you very much to the panel members for the wonderful talks and information. Thank you for the questions. And have a nice lunch.
Oh, how are you? I'm